Hallo Freunde, willkommen zurück zu .NET API Review. We're doing things differently today. We have a presenter because we have a giant issue, so we're not using just a issue track. Um, Hopefully, the public issue that we are tracking on the calendar, which is tracked as .NET Runtime 114793 Vector Data Abstractions. Hopefully, somewhere it links to what we're talking about, but I didn't need to click it, so I honestly don't know. With that, take it away, Shy.
All right. Yeah, I'll update the issue later with all of the relevant links and everything. So thanks for taking all the time for this. This is, as you said, a pretty big new thing that we're planning to GA for build, which is to say a few weeks away. This has been this is basically the culmination of a lot of work over a lot of months, and basically we're looking for any sort of feedback and in general, like you know any wisdom on this new API. So just to give some very general, before we dive into the actual API, just to give some general context. So this is a vector database abstraction. It's a client abstraction for a database, not unlike system data or ADO.NET. It's a bit similar in concept. So it allows you to insert data into databases and then query it back. But the databases targeted here are vector databases, which is a newish brand of databases. This is no longer a relational databases with tables and columns. The main thing that you do here is you insert records into collections. Collections are a bit like tables and records are a bit like rows. And those records typically have some metadata. They have whatever. They have a key, which allows us to query it by the key. And they have at least one vector property typically. And the vector property, this is where the magic happens. The vector is the thing that we can search over. So the primary thing you do with a vector database is the user, for example, inputs a query, you vectorize it or you generate an embedding for that. Then you go to the vector database and you say, give me the 5 topmost records whose vector property is similar to that one. So give me the 5 most similar things. It's very useful, for example, for semantic search, where you want to find the 5 most similar products given a text, or for the retrieval augmented generation pattern with LLMs, where you want to find some relevant information to the user's query and then put that in the prompt for the LLM to give the LLM extra context. This is why it's a very fundamental thing that everybody does with AI. It's a way of augmenting LLMs with external memory of any sort of or fashion, right? So that's like the really general kind of thing. More concretely, what we're doing here is this is an abstraction. So this is a way to use arbitrary vector stores or databases via the same API. This is an abstraction, and we already have around 12 implementations. We call them connectors. You'll hear that term a lot. So Postgres, Weaviate, Quadrant, SQL Server, Cosmos, many database, basically all databases today have some sort of vector search because it's so ubiquitous. Some are dedicated databases that do only this. Others, like SQL Server and Postgres, are existing databases which also have this sort of capability inside as well. We're targeting both things. So that's just to situate the general kind of thing. I thought that before we dive into what the API looks like, I would show a really quick kind of, getting started sample. I'm going to put you guys on my other screen. So I'm going to be looking to the side from now on, so I can share more easily. So just to give a very quick idea of what this actually looks like from a user perspective.
You'll need to control zoom that a couple of times, please.
Yep. Thank you for the reminder. There we go. So this is one, a very typical kind of use case. So one thing to already notice is that what MEVD does is it allows you to map a .NET type, unlike, for example, system data. So it's a bit more like an ORM in that sense. So users model the vector database, the schema, as a .NET type. This is a bit more high level than something like system data. So we say I've got an ID property that's a GUID, and we use in this case an attribute to say this is a key. This one is a data property. Sorry, here I actually, I did the copy paste here, but let's say we've got a vector property here. My sample here is a bit screwed up. So we say this is going to be a vector property, and it's got 10 dimensions. So I'm basically configuring a data model using attributes here. There's an alternative way to do this if you don't like attributes, but I'm not going to go into that level of detail right now. The important part here is, first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an actual connector vector store. So this kind of represents, let's say, the database. It's already specific. I'm instantiating this type specifically because I want to do Weaviate. In, for example, ASP.NET and DI applications, what the Weaviate connector will have an add Weaviate vector store extension method over service collection as a standard, so people will not be instantiating this directly. Weaviate specifically requires an HTTP client. This is an implementation specific thing. Another connector will have a different way of instantiating it. That's outside of the scope of the abstraction. But now we're kind of starting to be within the abstraction. We've got a store. What we can do with the store is, the operation I'm going to say is, we're going to get a collection from that abstraction. So this, again, from people familiar with databases, this basically, we're now getting like a table, basically something we can interact with, insert records into, conduct searches on. Collections are generic over two things. This is the key type. So Weaviate specifically supports only GUIDs, and that is what I have to put here. And then product here is the record type. So this is the .NET type that we're going to be mapping in the in this thing. These are the two generic, generic type parameters to that. What we give here is the name. So collections have names in the database because a vector store basically contains any number of collections. And there's various options. Specifically here, I'm going to configure it with an embedding generator, but I'm going to come back to this in 2 seconds. Once I've got a collection, I'm just going to show a couple operations. This is, again, just an intro. So I'm going to generate some random ID. I'm going to have my embedding here. So this is the actual vector. And the low-level representation, we're going to talk about that a little bit, is read-only memory of floats. So it's basically a bunch of floats. That's the vector, which has some sort of meaning. It doesn't really matter at this point where it came from. So I'm just instantiating here. Like, nobody will actually do this, but I've got my content here. And then I'm going to be doing this upsert. So I'm instantiating the product, and I'm going to be basically just inserting all of these things. There's some discrepancies here. I hope that's, don't catch me on there's no price above here. I just put this together at the end. But basically, this is an API that inserts a record into the database. It's an upsert. That's what these databases typically support, insert or update. That's the term used in database worlds in general. It's kind of like the standard thing also across vector databases, just for people not aware of it. Now we're going to use an API to fetch that thing back, given its ID. So this is the get async API on the collection that basically you give it an ID, you get back the record, same kind of thing. And finally, for the actual thing that, the point of the whole API here is the search embedding API. So this is the low-level search API, let's say, where what you do is you give it 2 mandatory parameters, you give it the vector. So this is like a new vector to search against. So find me things where the vector is similar to this 456, we have to mandatory parameter tell how many records we want back. So up to 3 records, never more than 3 records. And then we can also include some additional things. This is an optional kind of option bag sort of API where we can use link to also give a filter over the metadata. So in this case, we're saying filter by price is bigger than 8. This is a bit like a traditional SQL, filter. And of all the expensive products here whose price is bigger than 8, give me the 3 most similar ones to this thing here, 456. This is basically this is the heart of the whole exercise here, is this thing. This is how the actual application will use this at the end of the day. Upsertion, so I'll just say this, vector databases have this interesting quality where they're kind of asymmetrical. You've got the actual website doing the semantic search or doing the RAG, that's like the searching side. And the side that actually upserts data and deletes the maintenance of the data, that's typically not the same application, or it's not the same thing in any case. So you've got typically, for example, in the RAG pattern, you've got data coming in from, I don't know where, offline, like in a batch mode at night, you shove it into your vector database, and then the actual online program is doing your searching. There's a sort of a split here between actual similarity search on the one hand, and then data maintenance and CRUD operations on the other hand. This is unlike relational databases where you're doing queries and updates in the same kind of, they're interleaved together in the same transaction. Here, it's really 2 different types of consumers. It's going to impact the API a tiny bit. Now, one thing that I want to call out right away, this is a pretty low-level idea. So embeddings are already a low-level transformation of the actual data. The data is typically, this is actually something that we derived. We generate this from a text or an image or something, right? What users want is to actually search over text. This is how they actually use embedding vector databases, or search over text, search over images. It doesn't really matter. The detail of the read-only memory of float is something that I personally consider like a very, very low-level detail that users shouldn't be exposed to necessarily unless they want to. So what we also have here is the ability to configure the connector or an MEVDF connector with an embedding generator. And here we're referencing this thing, which maybe you recall from the MEAI API review. There's an I embedding generator. It's a thing that can take something and generate an embedding out of it. So we can configure MEVD with this thing. And at that point, if we choose to do this, we can use a search async API. Note the difference between search async and search embedding async. That's a whole thing I do want to discuss a bit later, but I'm just showing the API at this point. So search async is exactly the same, except that instead of giving it a vector, we're just going to give it the input text like this. And because we've configured an embedding generator under at setup time, when we did the DI and all that kind of stuff, then this will be converted internally automatically by MEVD into the embedding, and that's the thing that gets sent to the database. Are there any questions so far? This is like my intro. No questions. Okay. So I guess at this point, I'll jump back into API view and we can actually look at, how this thing looks like from an API perspective, the API we're proposing here. So the first thing, which you've already seen, is the thing called an iVector store. I'm going to note already, I'm just going to head off Jeremy here, I think, that we've already had the discussion of turning this into an abstract base class. There are some historic reasons why this was an interface originally, but Wesley and I discussed this a couple of days ago, and we think it makes more sense for this to be an abstract base class. We already know we need to add some things to it, so we don't want this to be breaking, obviously. So I'm just heading that off already. So there's an issue for doing that. So again, a vector store represents, we call this a store rather than a database, mainly because vector database tends to refer to the dedicated products like Weaviate and whatever and Quadrant, and not so much to SQL Server and whatever Postgres, which are general purpose databases with vector search capabilities. So we're using the term vector store. I don't think it matters too much. And then on this, we've got several operations. The one important, the operation we already saw before is this thing here called get collection, which is the thing that allows us to get, an object called collection to start manipulating the data and searching. So again, it's generic over the key and the record. It accepts a name, and it can also accept this thing I kind of glossed over. The vector store record definition is the way to define the schema without the attributes. So remember, I showed you guys the key, the data, and the vector before. If you don't want to do that, or if you can't, we'll maybe talk about dynamic mapping scenarios in a bit, then you have a vector store record definition, which we can dig into a bit later. And this basically provides the same information. It's just a place for saying what properties there are and what's their names and what's their types and what is the type of index for that vector property and what is the similarity, all kinds of metadata about that thing.
So
we're
Shai,
constraining.
in your sample, when I saw the call to get collection, and I assume your order is basically for key and value, but to me, GUID and product look backwards. It's just an instinct feeling because it feels like I want a collection of, and then product, and then the comma GUID saying that's my key type. So again, to me, these feel backwards. If everybody else disagrees, then it's fine. But that was just my immediate instinct when I saw it is those types are backwards.
So you put the product first and then the key as a second thing.
I mean, again, maybe it makes sense thinking of it as like a dictionary of key to value, but to me it felt like because it's get collection, it felt like I wanted a collection of product, and then GUID is a refinement detail on what I'm doing.
I see. Yeah.
I don't know. I think of it more as a collection, a dictionary, and key value is the natural ordering that we have pretty much everywhere. I can't think of any place that we have value, comma, kind of descriptor.
Fair enough. I think it's just because it's get collection, and so I expected it to be collection of T and not collection of key to T. And so maybe get collection is the wrong verb, but anyway, that I just wanted to share my instinct on that. Was it felt it felt backwards for reasons I can't articulate.
Yeah, I
I'm
could
definitely
imagine get keyed collection or something like that, but yeah.
collection is a pretty standard term here across the databases, which so we're just trying to use that to align to how the vector database world talks about itself. I've personally spent too much time for this to be weird to me. It's just like it's the thing I'm used to, so I have no intuition on it anymore. But
Yeah, and like,
yeah.
it could be fine. I just wanted to share my gut reaction. So.
Okay.
At
No,
what
that
point?
I can see that.
Same API but different question. At what point, if I specify invalid type parameters, at what point do I get an error? Is it
Right
when
now
I call the method? Okay.
at this point? So get collection is heavy-ish sort of method in the sense that it does a lot of validation. This is also the point where, for example, unless you're in native AOT, we're going to actually reflect over this to discover the properties. We're going to read the attributes over them. We're gonna build an internal model of this in the EF kind of sense of model, so an idea of which properties there are inside this thing. We're going to do a lot of validation here. Are the properties on the product, for example, do we actually support GUID as an ID at all here? Does this match this thing? Because there could be a discrepancy here, obviously, right? So all that is done as part of get collection. You will never get a collection here that is invalid in some way, in that way, in any case.
You said if not native AOT. Native AOT, we don't do that same reflection. We don't have these type parameters annotated for preserving the metadata or anything.
Yeah, I've got a whole thing for native AOT later. So this thing, as you see it, basically uses reflection over this, right? Which is already going to be a problem because these things could get trimmed, for example, right? As an example. There's the way what's even worse about this is like we're going to have to support hierarchical data models where inside product you've got another nested thing, and that maps to a JSON database, like a Mongo kind of thing. So basically the plan here, post-build, we're not doing this for build because there's not enough time. We're probably going to have to go with a source generator approach where something a little bit like what's in system text JSON, where you have some sort of, like you have a JSON serializer context, which is partial and gets attributes, and that gets source generated, augmented, and so on. So we're going to have something like this, and that means that we're going to have some sort of get collection to accept that source generated artifact. That API is not yet finalized. That's one reason why I'm really happy about us moving to abstract base classes, because then we can introduce it later at least. Yeah, probably. So I've got a prototype where there's an additional parameter here to accept those things that are source generated, and that one would not be annotated with requires on reference code and all that kind of thing. I hope that.
What does introducing that helps answer my question? But what does introducing those APIs later look like? Typically, when we add new APIs to a base class, an abstract base class, we're adding new virtual methods that delegate to one of the existing methods, or the less preferred but still done approach of the base method throws and there's some sort of can or is Boolean property that's also virtual that defaults to doesn't support, but you can override to say it's supported. What approach are we taking here?
So the first thing to know is that we currently own all of the connectors. We also maintain those connectors. So this is not the kind of abstraction where there's a ton of implementations out there, not right away anyway. We're in very close touch also with the one implementation that's going to be external. We're very much in touch with them, and I really hope that we get this native AOT story out the door relatively quickly after build as well. At which point maybe this is not such a bad story. In my mind, I'm thinking of doing the second thing of basically throwing. Whether we're going to be needing the capability flag kind of thing to check whether that thing is supported, I guess we could go that way. But that's currently what the way I'm seeing it. We simply don't. Ideally, we would have had all of this ready by now, but we just didn't have the time.
Okay.
It's not a perfect story, 100%.
And then with the validation, if somebody doesn't use the attributes and they use the sort of data model parameter, that's also being verified at the time of get collection.
Exactly. In fact, they can use both. We're still kind of working out the details on this, but you can use these and then complement them with the data model, and that also has to be verified, like that things are compatible. You're not saying one thing here and a completely different thing there, and that whole thing is part of a very distinct validation phase that we have while building the internal model. And if you got back a collection that then cannot be used in some way, that's a bug in our code that we need to fix. The idea is that the collection is supposed to be usable from
And
a validation correctness point of view.
and nothing in Git collection talks to the store.
Nope.
It just makes a
So-
back hook to get to the store.
That's a great question that leads me to the next thing. So if you look at this again at iVector store, you've got so you've got the get collection. It's not async, it's a sync API, whereas the actual creation is on the store itself. So we've got the creation here. Having an instance of this thing doesn't say anything about whether that thing already exists in the database. There's no way it could. This could be deleted by somebody else at any point, obviously, so it makes no guarantees. All this is a stub, an object, a proxy for doing things on that collection. And then all the actual operations are here. I hope that makes sense. The naming here is get on the store. It's not create, to avoid that kind of confusion, because it doesn't actually create anything. It just gets the thing that we're going to be using to do stuff. And then on the actual record collection, we've got the create. Make sense?
Yep, just making sure that the lack of async was correct.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's very much the intention here. Other operations that we've got on the store are basically collection management APIs, right? These are control plane operations, so you can delete a collection here. Now, that's actually an important point. We changed some stuff recently. You will notice that we've got delete collection here, but we've also got it on the collection itself. That's a somewhat weird duplication. The reason for this is if we only had it here, that's actually the thing we had. That means that you first need to get a collection and therefore have the complete schema for it just in order to delete the collection, which doesn't make any sense. Deleting doesn't actually need any sort of schema. It's just a simple operation. So it's important to be able to delete a collection without the whole building dance around it. That's why we have it here. On the other hand, it seems very useful for somebody to be able, for example, to register one of these guys, the collection object in DI, and then that gets injected anywhere, and the consumer of this thing can do everything that it wants on it. For example, it can check whether it exists, delete it, create it, and so on and so forth, without having to also have access to an iVector store at the same time. So it's like, I personally don't love that there's the same operation at the two levels in a way, but there's very valid scenarios, I feel, for both of these, and hopefully that kind of makes sense.
Is the operation of I want to clear out my vector store, like I want to delete all collections, is that something that anyone ever cares to do? And if so, is the way I would do that would be list collection names and then for each over them to delete each?
Exactly. That's how
and,
we would support it right now, yeah.
And I don't know if anyone actually cares to do that. If no one cares to do it, it's not a big deal. If someone did care to do it at some frequent basis, do the databases generally support a more efficient mechanism, or is the way that they support it exactly what we just said, enumerate all of them and delete each?
As far as I know, and Wesley, feel free to jump in if I'm wrong, but I've not seen a clear all tables operation on any database. It's exactly like this.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything like that either.
Okay. I mean, it's a nice thing about being. It would be a nice thing about having this be an abstract base class is we could always add a delete all
Exactly.
with a base implementation that just called list collection and delete on each, and an override could do something more efficient. But okay,
Absolutely.
Great.
Exactly. That's exactly the things we have in mind. We've got the same thing for, we discussed this about create collection if not exists, which is because this is an interface, everybody has to implement this. This can now have a default implementation, which checks if it exists and then creates it if it doesn't, right? So we can do that on our level with default.
Which we could do with an extension method, but then it wouldn't permit a specialized implementation. So we think there are specialized implementations for those kinds of operations.
There are, yeah. For create if exists or if not exists, absolutely. Databases absolutely do have these operations. Like Postgres has a specific syntax.
I do want to put a little bit of caution here in that if you do make a single method that is delete everything, would users expect that method to be atomic?
Oh, atomicity is a whole subject here. Obviously, like you'll see later, there's various things, various methods. For example, we've got upsert, which gets an enumerable. So upsert multiple records in. Is that atomic? And the answer is, it depends. This is a leaky abstraction, like most database abstractions. In some databases, this will actually be transactional and therefore atomic, like SQL databases. Others simply don't support it. In some implementations, we just do a for each and send like implement the batch ourselves, and it's not atomic at all. So that is a painful point, but unfortunately, we're going to be leaky on it.
Can I assume that for databases that do support transactions and support system.transactions, that this would just sort of naturally inherit it? Like if I create a transaction scope and I perform a bunch of operations via iVector store, that's actually a SQL backed thing, that it would just work? Or does it fall apart because this is the middle?
So right now, the current implementations for the SQL databases is to begin a transaction manually inside, which I would need to think about it for a tiny bit, but that would be incompatible with a transaction scope outside. But this is something that we can make work. So it's, and it wouldn't be like a breaking change. It would be like we would need to kind of not begin a transaction internally. And if there's already an ambient transaction via transaction scope, basically, that's an improvement we can do.
The other thing maybe to call out here is that these are all retryable. So upsert, you can essentially retry it until all of the records in it are upserted, because the operation is idempotent.
Yeah, there was one edge case, Wesley. I'm struggling to remember where it's not idempotent because you're inserting because and your IDs are database generated.
Yeah,
right?
It's where this. Yeah, exactly. But yeah,
for most
an
cases,
edge case. It is an edge case, and everywhere else it's idempotent. Same with delete. We essentially the specification for implementers is that delete shouldn't throw if the keys are already deleted. It should only throw for failures. Therefore, you can continue to retry delete until all of them succeed.
Yeah, it's important noting that our design principle here is for the operations to be as idempotent as possible. Again, we're dealing with very different types of databases here, so it's not 100%, but it's only edge cases where this is not the case, actually.
And parallel writers.
Sorry?
And concurrent writers. Two people doing conflicting upserts
sure.
aren't... that is not idempotent because you just keep stomping on top of each other. So.
Yeah. If we're on that, I personally had I had a question about implementation. So what we sometimes do, I want to hear what people here think. So for this sort of upsert, in some case, again, if the database doesn't expose a batching upsert, then what we do in implementations very frequently, we could do a for each, but we actually do them in parallel. So we launch X tasks for like a task for each of the record, and then we do task when any on them, which I'm kind of like it makes it potentially finish earlier, but then you're also kind of placing a lot more load on the server and forcing it to do things concurrently as well, which I'm kind of not used to seeing. Does anybody have any opinion on this?
We generally try hard to avoid introducing concurrency where there wasn't already some, and leave that to higher level concerns to do. Just because it starts introducing, if I had an implementation of this that was backed by, an in-memory store or something, and it wasn't expecting concurrent usage, well, I've just introduced concurrent usage without it being obvious.
I see.
So in general, we try to avoid it and just leave it up to the caller to say, okay, I would like that, or have it be opt-in, like in a closed space here with MEAI for the function invocation chat client. Like you might get multiple function calls back from, function call requests back from the server, and you could invoke those serially or you could invoke them concurrently. Default, we invoke them serially, but we have an option flag that says, opt into doing concurrently, which then you're opting into the possible corruption that could result from concurrent usage. You're opting into the increased possible concurrent load, and you're opting into the possible.
Makes sense.
So my default would be to say
Not introduce. Yeah.
not introduce unless someone chooses it.
Okay, I've made a note. We'll discuss this. Sorry, Jeremy, you seem like you said.
I was
you had
gonna.
something
So,
to say.
Steve, would you say that you're suggesting putting a bool parallel, if possible, equal false here, or different method, or what?
It could be on the concrete implementation of the vector store record collection. Like it could be an overall setting. When I publish my thing at DI, I just configure this instance does stuff in parallel.
Okay.
Doesn't need to be on the actual method itself.
Yeah, I would expect this to be somewhere in the setup because it's also not relevant to all implementations. Some implementations have a perfectly nice batching API, and of course, when they do, then we just batch, we don't parallelize. So that wouldn't be relevant for them. But those that don't, we could expose a flag in the options for parallel upsertion or not for people who actually care. My gut would be also to not parallelize. I'm a bit more like if you've got actual load happening, like multiple concurrent users, then you're actually shooting yourself in the foot by parallelizing, right? Anyway, but that I don't want to go too far into that discussion.
It's also the thing where like this could be done via like you can layer on the concurrency
exactly
with some hand waving via a separate API that's either another virtual or an extension method where it's very clear that you're doing it in parallel.
Yeah, you could also make your own connector wrapping another one.
Yeah, we've got a single record upstart, so you can perfectly well do that, the exact same thing outside of the abstraction if that's what you want to do, like users. Okay, yeah, that's already something I kind of wanted to ask. Okay, so we were talking about the duplication of the APIs, like between the store and the collection. There are two such APIs. One is delete collection, and one is collection exists. Both of these are operations that exist on both things. Note also naming wise that this means that on the collection itself, you now have delete collection next to delete async. And it's implicit here that delete async is about records in the collection. That's the main sort of delete, whereas delete collection is explicit about being the control plane operation for deleting the entire collection. There's a bit of a, they're right next to each other, which could be a tiny bit weird. But again, because we feel like it's useful to have delete collection on the collection itself, that kind of makes sense. But I hope everybody's okay with this kind of approach. Same thing with the exists.
So does this suggest that I can get a collection that doesn't exist?
So once again, this object, the fact that you got this object doesn't mean anything about whether it exists in the database or not. This line here is.
It means that so this goes back to my question earlier about what validation is performed. So get collection is synchronous. It's validating that the parameters and both generic and not are correct, but it's not validating that the collection actually exists.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. So what validation happens on the model and the collect and let's say the options and the everything that's about the setup of the thing on my side, on the .NET side, that gets validated. There's no communication with the database. Otherwise, obviously, this would have been async. That is a completely different thing. And indeed, like you expect, so in many cases, collection creation is not even a concern of the application. It's an administrative task that happens once offline. You created your database, you're done. And now your application could just assume that it exists. Of course, if you do want to do that, you've got all these APIs, but then it's up to you to do something like create it if not exist. This is why we have this sort of API, right? You can do this. And this is now a round trip to the database, right?
And this
if that's what you want to do.
iVector store, this iVector store record collection is also when you're talking about becoming an abstract based class?
Yes, correct. Both of these interfaces, the store and the collection. Make sense?
Help me understand that experimental. Is that internal experimental just an artifact of the API review tool? I don't know what I'm looking at there.
Yeah, I'm not sure why we have experimental specifically on get service. I think that should actually be removed. So these are here. Yeah. Was there any idea why we still have it here?
Not sure. I think it was. I mean, we introduced it essentially for logging purposes. But yeah, I mean, I think if we're happy, we should just remove it and continue.
Yeah,
And
it's a
this
temporary thing.
term will largely go away with an abstract base class, but experimental on interface methods is not a good situation, because you can't actually changing what methods are exposed on an interface effectively changes the identity of the interface.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Another good reason to avoid interfaces here. Absolutely. Okay. Now, I still have some. I have quite a few naming things here, but first, I think we're. Yeah, there's one last API here, which is on the store. This way we can say goodbye to the store soon, which is list collection names. That's again something we see, possible on all, all databases allow you to list the stores. We've had a bit of, contention on what this should return. So it currently returns an async enumerable string. This is an async method in any case. We contact the database. There's not been complete agreement on whether it's better to return an async enumerable string or just a list here. Now, the thing here is it can be streamed. So technically, we can absolutely stream it, and it would allow users to start getting back results early. On the other hand, collection names are typically, so on the one hand, you're not supposed to have a lot of them, but if you do have a lot of them, and we do think there are some scenarios where you've got a ton of collections, this API isn't really good for that anyway, because you can't filter. You can only get all of the collection names anyway via this kind of API. So there's no provisions in this API to only list the collections you care about, basically. So then the thing to, like, basically I'm kind of thinking, should we be imposing async enumerable on the user, especially given that there's no to-list. So there's no to-list async in .NET versions before 10. That was just introduced in .NET 10. So working with, if you actually do just want to, have a list of these, you have to now take a reference on system link async or whatever that package is called. And basically it degrades the user experience a little bit. And my personal position is I'm not sure whether the streaming collection names, which are inherently like more of a control plane kind of thing, is that really useful? I know that Wesley thinks the other way, and I'm kind of like, what are people's intuitions on this?
What would you do? What even in the situation where you have, 10,000 collections or 1 million collections, what is the benefit of the async enumerable? Is it avoiding, you're looking for a specific name by pattern, and so you're trying not to store all 1 million collection names, or you think you can parallelize operations by kicking something off as the names arrive? Or what is it that you would be doing that would benefit from the transient nature of the async enumerable?
For me, it would be the former, to make sure that, as let's say you're looping through them and deleting them one by one, you don't have to essentially create a list object with 1 million of them in memory before you start processing. But yeah, this is definitely an edge case, and it's, it is problematic in that a lot of the databases do not support filtering on this anyway. So it's a very basic API simply to cater for the basicness of some of the implementations that are available.
Do you have a sense of like the P95 cardinality? Like we're saying 10,000 and we're saying 1 million, is the expected answer always generally more like 7?
Like, we know there's one scenario which is multi-tenancy where you might end up having a collection per tenant. I still have a hard time believing millions here. Again, given most databases don't even expose an API for dealing with this list, in an efficient way. They just allow you to get it. But I will argue against myself though, just to say that we do have other APIs which we do believe should return async enumerable, like getting records. So it's not like this is the only async enumerable. We're already forcing users in theory to deal with async enumerable. So that's actually an argument against myself. But yeah.
I mean, I don't see anything wrong with async enumerable here. It is adding a little bit of complexity for some use cases at the expense of some possible efficiency gains for other ones. So I really think it comes down to what do you expect the most common scenarios to be. For the multi-tenancy one, like it seems really unlikely that you would want to then proceed to delete every implementation, every collection across all tenants.
Yeah.
So what would the use case be in that situation for even calling this? Like, in what situation are you enumerating all of the collections?
Yeah, we're in the uncomfortable situation of doing the abstraction, and we don't have a, we don't have a clear view of every usage that somebody might have of this API. Yeah, I personally don't have a great answer to that.
I mean, I would leave it up to you to. I think either iList or iasync enumerable are totally reasonable here, and it's just up to you to decide which one is going to be more ergonomic for more situations.
I, mean,
If we
I would
do-
be skeptical of iList. List is fine. iList
In,
asks questions.
in another API that's going to be discussed, you have a concept, I think, of filtering the results. Does it, if you do have a situation where you have absolute gobs of collections, for instance, and you do want to retrieve names that fulfill a certain criteria, does it ever make sense to add a filter constraint to that, or is that just not practical given what we're talking about?
So most maybe databases, Wesley would know, simply don't support that. Like the dedicated vector databases simply expose what you see here, which is get me all the records. In SQL databases, querying the names of tables is just another query. So yeah, you can filter on it because you can filter on anything anyway, right? So it's not like they added filters specifically for this. It's just a generalized capability of the database. So I would say, like in the general case, you don't have filtering capabilities here for many of the database.
So
The
if
tricky
you
thing
paired
is
and cast to the concrete type and filter, okay.
the tricky thing, of course, is as well, what do you filter on? Is it some sort of wild card on the name, or is it, do you want to filter on other metadata that, like schema information or so on about the collection? But obviously schema information is quite specific to different databases. A lot of them, don't allow filtering because there's nothing to filter on that they feel is valuable, because creating a collection is a very simple operation for them. So yeah, it's filtering is not well defined, I feel here.
Yeah, I agree. Like in SQL databases, you can do wildcards on the string name. Obviously, that's a very specific kind of filter. That's it. Like,
Yeah, no complaints that I push this question. Actually, I want to go back to line 113 real fast, since it's on the screen, get service. Was the conclusion here that we should remove the attribute or we should remove the method? Because the method is marked as internal, isn't it?
I don't see how it could be an internal method given that it's an interface.
Right.
That's what 111 says.
Yeah, is that a tool thing? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't know if the consensus here was that the method should stay without the attribute, or if both the method and the attribute should go away.
I think we're saying only the attribute goes and the method stays.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
So this is basically the same get service that you've got in MEAI, which is a way of extracting arbitrary internal things, internal in that sense. For example, we have a metadata object that vector stores expose. This is how you get the name of the collection. It's one way to get the name, so that loggers composed on top can call this, ask for metadata, and then get the name through it and log that. That's like the reason we originally introduced this. It's a general pattern that we copied over from MEAI, basically.
Oh, yeah, the scenario makes sense. I just wanted to make sure that what Jeff
Sure.
wrote down here matched what we all said a few minutes ago.
Absolutely,
Okay.
makes sense.
So is that we're removing internal, keeping get service, and making it non-experimental. Cool.
Exactly.
Thanks for clarifying that, Levi.
Okay. I guess for the iasync enumerable, Wesley will have one final chat. I have really no strong feelings on this. I'm fine with whatever you feel like.
And you've got it named with an async suffix. So if we ever felt like you could do list collection names, have both if we wanted to, but
I think the async one would be task of list. Sorry, the list one I don't think was supposed to be list. It was supposed to be task of list. So it's async either way. You don't get to just slap async on and fix it.
Jeremy, would you name this differently because it returns an async enumerable, basically?
No, that's the name that I mean. You could do enumerate collection names.
Yeah, list, enumerate, and get are all fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes
I would only
enumerate.
do.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I was gonna say I would only do enumerate if we thought we might. Excuse me. Allergies. If we thought we might add a list in the future.
Yeah, I don't see us having both on this API.
Yeah,
That's weird.
Because enumerate versus get is the enumerate one says it's not buffering before returning the answer. It's returning, or I mean, it suggests it's returning it in more as I get it, you get it manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, my feelings.
We have a variety of patterns.
Sure. So my feelings here would be if this was the only async enumerable, I would say drop it for the reasons you said. And if the P95 was going to be, over 50,000 or over, over like 11 fetches or something, then you should use a async enumerable. It sounds like you're exactly in the middle where you get to flip a coin. So.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, we'll flip a coin then. Okay, so I think we're now done with the store, unless anybody has other questions around this. Okay, at this point, maybe I want to jump into a quick, maybe not so quick, a discussion about naming here. There's one issue with the way things are currently done is the naming is a bit long, and we're looking for opportunities to make the naming a bit more palatable. So iVector store, I think we kind of like, but then this is still kind of maybe okay, iVector store record collection. But then what I also did is, if you look at our implementations, this is an example of one of our connectors. I very intentionally chose like one of the worst offenders in terms of length. So this is what it looks like. Now that's not the fault of the abstraction per se. So there's lots of things here which we could just remove. Like we don't have to say Azure because it's Cosmos, and DB with uppercase is I think an offense in .NET naming anyway, which we need to kind of iron away. But then basically, the one thing that I wanted to bring up is what people would feel like if we made this shorter in various ways, and we went through various scenarios. I think one that we liked kind of maybe okay is to drop the store from here. So we could call it an iVector record collection, because a vector record is kind of good enough maybe as a thing. And parallel to that discussion is what people feel about how the implementations of this should be named. So does every implementation have to repeat the whole thing, or can we just call this something like Cosmos Mongo collection, or Cosmos, all that kind of discussion?
So to be pedantic for a moment, you said you're switching to abstract classes, but you keep pronouncing the I's. I assume you're just dropping the I's.
I'm still used to it. Yes, I'm dropping the I's, obviously. Just used to it.
Okay.
Do we expect anywhere else in .NET to use record in this like record collection? I mean, I understand we use it in C#, but in a different capacity. I'm wondering if we could just drop vector store entirely from these types and just have them be, record collection.
Yeah. I think we should definitely consider it on the implementations for sure, which is what people will be like. Maybe we do slightly different things for the name of the interface, or abstract base class rather, and for the actual implementations. I'm not sure. I'm just saying. I personally am now leaning even more towards making it, short, even though it's going to be slightly ambiguous in certain situations. I'm looking for guidance, basically.
I mean, on the abstract base class, what was it about? Vector store record collection? Is that what it is?
Like right now, it's vector store record collection. One thing which is relatively like not far-reaching is to just call this a vector record collection, rather than repeating the store, because we're already in vector data namespace and package and all that kind of thing, and it contains the vector word inside. We could also go further and call this a record collection, but that starts to be really quite generic for me in the .NET context. That could really be anything at all. So I'm kind of Like, I don't love that too much, but I do kind of like it if we do that on the implementation, because if you call this a Cosmos Mongo record collection, there's much less ambiguity there, because you've got Cosmos Mongo to tell you this is a database thing and so on.
Is the occurrence of the word collection important for the vector store kind of concept? I know it's how these things are typically named, but I'm wondering if, like, these aren't typical .NET collections, right? They're not implemented
No.
in iCollection.
No,
So
absolutely not.
So I'm actually wondering if including the word collection, and if we instead did something that's a little bit more unusual, but had, iVector records or something.
I remember we talked about this, yeah.
Just because it isn't an iCollection, and so it might actually be confusing to call this.
So
I don't know.
It is a conceptual collection, in the sense that it is a collection of records, right? It's true that we don't have it like implementing iCollection, so that's not great. I don't know. I can't remember any similar case where we named something plural like that, like records. It's weird. Like, what is that thing? Is it like records is not a thing? It's
right.
many things.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I think we're trying to find the least bad. I also can't remember any time where we've called something collection and it's not a collection. It's not an iCollection or an iList or whatever.
The guidelines say to use collection if it's IEnumerable, but these may also not be IEnumerable.
Yes, these aren't IEnumerable either.
Yeah. So I searched for the word plural in FDG. There's recommendation for plural namespaces. There's recommendation for plural names on the properties that expose collections, and there's make a flags enum plural. Those are the only times the word plural appears in the guidelines. So we presumably have no plural types, because a type is a noun. Now, granted, you get complicated English nouns like eyeglasses, which have no singular, but I'm just saying we don't have a good plural precedent to fall on. I think that the name, assuming we're not upset yet with record collection, though that was Steve's point, the Cosmos Mongo record collection felt fine to me. I do have some skepticism about the word record, given that the word record means something in the primary language of the .NET framework. Of the .NET platform.
Yeah.
But I also get that it's what they call them in the domain. So.
Yeah, we're in between the domain and the platform here, unfortunately. We have to constantly compromise between the two. Mm-hmm. Wesley, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, collection is really a domain term here as well, which is unfortunate because in .NET it has its own meaning. So, yeah, and there isn't really a lot of better naming. The problem as well is if you name it something else, then people will potentially struggle to figure out how does this map to the domain.
Yeah. The chat asks a semi-important question here, which is, how often is this name going to show up in somebody's code?
So it is something that when you set up your DI, you're doing add Cosmos Mongo vector store record collection today. At least that's the API and the setup phase of it. And then you're getting injected by it as well, right? Like your controllers or methods or whatever.
But presumably all your things should take the base class. You should just always accept the base record collection. When do you need the strongly typed one?
Oh, I see. I see what you're asking now. Most users, we suspect, are going to be using are going to be targeting one database. So they're not, most applications are not going to be targeting multiple databases. And in that kind of case, there's no necessary usage for them to use the abstraction as opposed to the implementation. The implementation will also, not currently, but in the future at least, we might expose implementation-specific operations as well. Like if Cosmos Mongo has a specific API that makes sense, we'd expose it, and then people would be able to use it only if they reference this type.
Sure.
So I, like personally,
that's interesting. I would have expected that even in the case where someone was just targeting a single database, they would still be using the abstraction for things like testability.
Maybe, maybe it is a good question. Like like in the ADO.NET kind of thing, people code against their database specifically, so they are referencing MPG SQL rather than doing DB connection or DB command. Like we usually see that more in the case where they need to target both SQL Server and MPG SQL. Testing is a concern, although what we would usually recommend is to abstract and like do the mocking or the abstraction at a higher level rather than at the actual database layer. People concerned with testing will absolutely be using the base classes here, like the abstraction. I agree with you there. The question is how many are actually going to be doing that.
Because I feel like I have never written against anything other than DB connection when I've used SQL and .NET.
Oh yeah?
Because I consider databases to be commodity. They're all the same, other than the ones you have to pay for, and I've never stored data I wanted to pay for.
So interestingly, I mean, we're a bit off topic, but it's nice that you've got DB connection and it's an abstraction, but the actual SQL that you send there is going to be different between Postgres and SQL Server, unless you're doing there's so many different differences in SQL dialect that abstraction is like breaks down almost immediately, by the way. So, I mean, here, this is actually a much better case. I think we're a better abstraction in that sense. We're less leaky than ADO.NET simply because there's no SQL. So we can be less leaky basically because we're more high level. Which might indicate that, yeah, it makes more sense to use the abstract. I don't know. It's a good question.
So what is the actual terminology that ends up being used in each of these underlying vector stores? Do people say record collection or do they just say collection? Like where does record come into play?
Yeah, I think it's typically collection, but we can do a quick run through the different ones maybe for the next session as well, just to get a good comparison. I did something similar for vectors to go and see what different systems and what our competitors as well are calling the store itself, and everyone was typically using vector store, but I didn't make a list of what the collection type is called everywhere, so maybe we can do that and have some data around it for the next meeting.
Just I'm wondering, because with things like iVector store, like if you had vector store collection, if this was purely .NET vernacular, that would seem like a collection of vector stores. But
yeah,
we're already not talking about .NET vernacular because these things aren't collections. So, if we're looking to make these shorter, and if record isn't actually something that's typically used together with collection, maybe you make it shorter by just dropping record, which also then maps with the APIs that were get collection, not get record collection.
You could go further and just do vector collection as well. I mean, it isn't strictly a collection of vectors, but it's certainly closer probably than vector store collection.
That one I'd have a little more trouble with. Like I can argue that this is a collection associated with a vector store.
Yeah.
Or it is a vector stores collection.
Yeah,
I don't know how I would do the same justification. Yeah, I don't know how I would do the same thing with vector collection. This isn't a collection of vectors, nor is it a vectors collection.
So or a collection inside a vector. Yeah.
Or a collection inside a vector. So I would have trouble going that far.
Yeah, so if you drop the Azure branding and the DBs that may not be necessary, then it sounds like that would then be Cosmos Mongo Vector Store Collection, which is looks like you're dropping between a third and a half of the current characters.
That's definitely great already, yeah. I personally would also argue, I don't know, Wesley, we didn't talk about this, but we have Mongo there because there's two variants of Cosmos. So there's Cosmos NoSQL and Cosmos Mongo, but those are two different packages. And maybe if we don't have to have it on the type name. So maybe we can just call it Cosmos Vector Store Collection. And then, yeah, the 0.5% using both packages have to disambiguate, but then all the others don't have to deal with that in the name. Like I'm more on that direction in general. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the guideline of avoiding name conflicts is unless they're in conflicting namespaces. So the odds of using a button from WinForms and WPF in the same library or process like ever is expected to be close to null. So
Right.
I would be concerned with intentionally putting two things in this is a choice. It's also with the current IntelliSense and package searching, etc. You would type this type name and it would be like, I found two hits. Which one do you want?
Yeah.
And so I would be a little concerned with that.
Oh, so you're saying we should keep Mongo and NoSQL in all the types because of the potential conflict.
If you're saying these are types that are actually going to appear in people's code, then
They might, but
yeah.
the expected number of people to actually reference both these things, that's really low to me. But
Fair enough. But the concern would be you're like, oh, I just need to say Cosmos Vector or Cosmos or new Cosmos Vector store, and it'll be like, would you like me to add a package reference to Cosmos Mongo
Which
or
one?
Cosmos
Yeah.
NoSQL? And I assume that's going to be alphabetical. So hopefully, when you're very quick on enter, Mongo's the one you wanted. So
Right.
and
Okay.
maybe you name the collections the same, but not the connectors. It's a question of what people would type and get the would you like me to go auto add this package reference or whatever. So that would be the concern.
Yeah. Anyway, that's a very Cosmos specific question, which we can debate. The what we do with the rest of it is more general and therefore more important. I guess. Yeah, I'd love to see, like, I personally would love to see something like even like going with what Stephen just said, like something like Cosmos Mongo collection. I know that I've chopped off almost everything, but it's basically a collection within Cosmos Mongo. It's I mean, that's the kind of thing I'd love to see at the end of it. But I recognize that it might be a bit
Actually,
too choppy.
going back to the apostrophe s interpretation. So you speak German. Pretend there's an invisible in there. The like Cosmos Mongo collection. This is a collection in the vector data sense, owned by or managed by Cosmos
Exactly.
Mongo. So that doesn't grate me the same way that Cosmos Mongo vector collection does.
So you're saying you do want to keep the vector in there?
No, I'm saying if you keep vector, you need to keep store. But I think it's okay if you drop both of them.
I see.
So Cosmos Mongo collection, that's Cosmos Mongo's collection. This is also weird because I know that this is sort of databasey, so every time I see collection, I'm actually hearing connection, which is just driving
Right.
me batty. But that's a me problem.
Sorry about that. What's your reaction, Wesley, to something like Cosmos Mongo collection? Is it too? Are we going too far?
No, I quite like that. I like that more than some of the suggestions on the base class, because here I think it is quite clear. It's a collection. Yeah, it's a collection inside of that database, which is to me is pretty clear.
Okay, so then Postgres collection, Quadrant collection, Cosmos Mongo collection, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. I think that's really great. And then on the base class, if we go back to that, I think we were.
I didn't have the link to the concrete implementations API view.
Oh,
Can
sure.
you drop that into the chat, please?
Thanks. Let me do that. Let me do that right now. There we go. So for this one, did we end up saying vector store collection?
I think so.
That basically, I think that goes with the same principle, right? Mongo collection, vector store collection, and then Mongo is the vector store.
Yeah, and then you instead of saying a foo vector store collection, you replace vector store with foo. Would
Okay.
be the naming suggested pattern.
Okay. Are you okay with that, Wesley?
Yeah, sure. If everyone thinks that's the right approach, it's probably not my favorite.
What would be your favorite?
Simply because I think it does sound like a collection of vector stores, but I can see the other side of it as well. That in the collection is a common term again in this space. So it should hopefully be clear to people that this is a collection in a vector store, not a collection of vector stores.
Right.
And in fairness, people will only make the mistake once if they do make the mistake. So, yeah, long term, this probably shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative would be that you replace all your usages of collection with, data set or some other.
Yeah.
Please no, not that. That's not that.
Indeed. I mean, like, data seems weird, and there's no other. I was just trying to think of a term that is, because it's not a table, it's not a view, it's not a. Apparently, database people don't like inventing nouns, so.
Levi has suggested word containers in the chat.
Well, that was just because I was trying to look at prior art that other people like Azure Blob Storage had, but container is a term of art for them, just like collection is a term of art for you. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think vector store collection is probably, if we want to go shorter, that's probably the best option.
I'm very, very fine with that. All right.
I'm
great.
also fine with being shorter, especially since we also have the option bugs, which even have a longer names.
Yeah. These exactly what Adam is saying. These are actually things that we append other things to. So it's even, the situation is actually even worse. Like if you look at this guy here, look at this, for example. So yeah, we do have a good reason to try to keep these short. All right, so that's awesome. I'm very happy we came to consensus on this. I'm just looking and kind of thinking how to do this. I think what I'm going to do is I'd love to continue on this on the record API now, and maybe leave the searching, which is a big topic, for the next one, for Thursday. I think that kind of makes sense.
Okay. So there's a question from chat already. Now that we're here, which is should create if not exists yield the answer of did it create it or did it already exist?
Do you remember, Wesley, if database, like, is it that databases don't typically give us that information, or did we just forget it?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question properly.
It's about if create collection if not exists should return a bool to say whether it actually created or not. And actually that question can be extended to delete as well.
Mm-hmm.
Both delete and delete collection, in fact.
Yeah, we didn't really consider it. I think on the delete side, though, if I remember correctly, not all databases supported that. I don't think we considered it for create.
Like for a database that doesn't support it, what would we return at that point, right? Would be the question.
Yeah, I mean, they both have the idempotent problem of you call create if not exists, you get some sort of intermediate error. You call it again, and it says, "Oh, it already exists." And what it means is, I created it the first time. I just couldn't give you the answer.
Right.
I wonder if this is a case where if you really care about that and your database happens to expose this as a feature, you pass to the concrete type, and the concrete type offers an API that gives you the answer.
Could be. Absolutely could be.
I mean, they can't. I guess in this case they could. If this is virtual, they could use more specific return type override.
I mean, you could use method
but
hiding instead.
But it's task.
You could hide the method. You could overload the method. You have lots of options.
Yeah, but task of T derives from task. So a task of bool would be a more specific.
Oh, I see. Because it's a non-generic task, right?
Would be a more specific answer. You're right. They could use new and hide the. All right, so there would be answers.
Yeah.
There's also the option of course, just doing check first, right? Like the less nice option if you really want to do it via the abstraction.
Yeah, it's because I feel like the only reason you'd want the answer is if you want. I'm the creator. I need to do some initialization work, and again, networking errors happen. You could have created it during a connection that you didn't get the answer, so you'd miss the signal, which means you actually need some other way to know it's now in created but not initialized. So if we want to support people being tolerant to network failures, we should not tell them the answer.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because it's sort of I can't think of why you would want it except to say, oh, I need to go run initialize. But that's, if it's true, if it says I created it, then yes, and if it didn't, you still need to go ask a question, do I need to run initialize? So the false is misleading.
Is there a more succinct name than create collection if not exists async?
So EF has ensure collection exists, and ensure, like we call it, ensure database exists, or ensure database even. We just call it ensure database, and or ensure database created and ensure database deleted.
For a lot of our other
No, we
collection
have
types, we
ensure
just have
created
get
and
or
ensure
create,
deleted.
which gets the existing one if it exists, and otherwise creates and returns the new
Okay.
one.
Can you repeat, Tanner, and then Yishi?
We have get or create for many of our other collection types, like for dictionaries and some of the concurrent types, which gets the existing one if it does exist, and otherwise creates the new one, and returns that if it does create it.
Yeah, though here it doesn't actually get it doesn't return. It's not like a concurrent dictionary sort of API, right? It does nothing at all if it already exists and doesn't. There's no meaningful return type here.
Yeah, so it'd be like bind or create and bind, which is weird. And I'm aware that's more that thing AD uses.
Yishi, you were saying something. Sorry.
Yeah, on EF we have ensure created and ensure deleted.
Ensure created.
It's already on the database property.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, if we like that, we could have it on the collection, but then it doesn't make sense to have these APIs because we also have them on the store, and even on the collection, it's a bit ambiguous. Ensure created because everything else is by default on a record. You can't people would think, is it ensure created for some record? Like I think we do want to have the word collection in the API.
Yeah. So when you get the collection, you have a collection in Potentia. So would this make sense to be open async and open or create async? And create async?
So open is terminology I'm used to seeing on connections, which you open and close.
Yeah.
Whereas these are very much non-stateful things. By the way, these are expected to be by default thread safe, so you can use this thing concurrently, and it's supposed to do whatever it needs under the hood. So the user isn't supposed to be concerned with like connections or anything like that.
Okay. Oh, I guess so. So maybe it's a thing I missed earlier. So if you call get collection, you can then immediately call get async if it already exists.
Yep.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Sorry, I was thinking you needed to call create or create if not exists to even start using the thing. So
if you have no idea if the collection is there, which we think is actually a more rare usage, like again, usually your database is there and it has been set up. It's not like every time you run your application, you need to do this in all places. In most places, you get this instance, like you're basically getting injected with an implementation of this thing, and then you just query. You don't need to. You can assume that the thing is there, and if it's not, it's going to error. Make sense?
Yep. So create is a distinct path that you go down when you think you need to create it, as opposed to every time you want to talk about it.
Exactly. It's rare, expected to be a rare thing, actually. Adam, go ahead.
If it's so rare, could we move it to the vector store and call it get or create async?
So get and create here are very, very different things. I don't really see how they could be like this or that. So on the one hand, how do I say this? Like
I mean,
you're basically
Tanner has suggested that we could reuse the naming of get or create, and the point was that it cannot be get because it does not return anything. And
right.
since you have said that these methods are part of the collection to make them more easy to discover, and they will be frequently used, and this one isn't supposed to be frequently used, maybe it could be part of the vector store.
I
So
think
you could be like, get me a collection or get or create me a collection.
I think yeah, I know we discussed this in quite a bit before as well, and one of the things we were trying to avoid was forcing a database call every time, you know, to ensure that the collection exists. Now, I don't know, maybe Adam, you're suggesting that we have a non-async get and then a get or create, which is async and does the creation and everything. But yeah, then you can't pass around a collection that's initialized and kind of use it anywhere to verify that it exists and initialize it on first use, which is kind of a nice scenario in some cases, I suppose. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
If
I'm
we-
fine with no being the answer.
No. I mean, so if we didn't want to have the API also on the collection, then I think something like get or create async on the store would be a good API, actually. That would be my preference as well. But I think we're saying that we want users to be able to just do everything via the collection, because that's useful. And at that point, doing get or create on the store would mean we need a differently named API on the collection, and then you have a discrepancy between the two. That's kind of where this gets weird for me.
You also have this discrepancy of like, well, are we saying that collection always exists? Are we guaranteeing its existence when we've created it, which, you know, get or create seems to kind of push us in that direction, as opposed to saying, well, we don't really know ever whether it exists, which I think is a safer assumption to make, because somebody could have deleted elsewhere.
I agree. However, with the get or create, it would be clear that it does exist, because as Jeremy said, he was not sure whether he gets a collection that was created or not.
Yeah, and the tricky thing is, like, what if you create the collection object yourself, not via the vector store? Should we stop people from doing that then, you know, and always push them to kind of to get and create via the vector store, and then, you know, we say, oh well, at least we checked a few minutes ago that it existed, and then you can't use just the collection on its own, which I think kind of isn't great, because I think probably the most common scenario is going to be that people have a single collection that they created previously in some other application, and they only ever want to use it, and no one's going to delete it. And if they do, you know, that is obviously a massive incident and outage for them. But they typically are not going to delete it. They're just going to consume that, you know, over and over again.
Yeah, like it looks like this, basically. A typical user could just do this, and they're done, right? Using our new naming, or do the same thing via DI. Like we've got DI methods to basically get this to get registered in DI. And then at that point, this is where we're coming from when we say we want the user to be able to do something like this now.
And speaking of DI, it makes it easier because DI is only synchronous as of today. So if it's not created, it's just an object, and then you can initialize it in asynchronous way once you actually want to start using it.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Creative exists. The fun do nothing API.
I mean, we can still call this something like this if we want to go the EF route. Ensure collection created async. Is that better? No, I'm not sure. Maybe. We can test.
It's
can
not
also-
this. It's not much shorter.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could knock off this, but then we've got the ambiguity with the records, as I was saying before.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And then instead of ensure created, I'd say ensure exists. Personally,
Sure exists. The thing is, there's a yeah.
Well, I mean, it would be ensure collection exists, because it
Yeah.
takes no predicate, so you're not. Yeah.
Or there is an alternative. The way they are implemented, they typically delegate it to a method that takes a Boolean parameter, and the first overload is sending false, the other one is sending true. So it could be like create collection with a Boolean parameter saying if it exists or not.
I see. So you're saying something like this. Wait. So what's the name of the method in that case?
Create collection, I think.
And then the bool is
Because we
something
have
like,
because we have two of those methods, right? So I'm just saying that instead of having two, we could have one with a Boolean parameter.
and then the bool would be called like a throw with if exists, something like that.
Yeah.
Any feelings from anybody? I don't dislike this actually. I don't know.
There is a guideline somewhere which says never have a Boolean. Do you want me to throw?
Nice.
Um,
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah,
says something like it says that the API designers couldn't make up their mind.
I mean, these are two different
Yeah.
these are two different scenarios where in one like users legitimately might need one or the other.
Yeah. Just do not have public members that can either throw or not based on some option. And then a sample
Which is
bad
what this
design
is.
type.get type string name comma bool throw on error. So it throws type.get type under the bus. So
But weren't we just saying a few minutes, like at the beginning of this review, though, that certain databases might not have the concept of allowing you to atomically detect whether something exists and create it if it doesn't? And presumably, if you care about that behavior and we can't give you a definitive atomic answer, presumably we shouldn't pretend to give you an answer.
So-
Presumably, we should tell you if you really care about it, like cast and call a specialized
Yeah.
API for it.
which and maybe what you're saying here, Levi, is why do we care about create or fail?
Right.
If we go back to the idempotent thing, create or fail is not idempotent because you call it, it made the thing exist. You network error, you call it again, and it smacks you because it already exists. So, calling create feels like an anti-pattern, so maybe you should just not support it, and create should be create if not exists, and you should just document it as such.
So one thing I want to add is we don't actually pretend to guarantee atomicity. Like that's not a feature of the API, which is why I do think this is kind of okay. Like it's perfectly valid for create if not exists to not be atomic, or even for create or fail to not be atomic.
I think, yeah, maybe something to add is one of the. I remember us discussing this briefly some time ago as well, and the problem with create is that if somebody created a collection previously and they used a different schema to the one that they are proposing right now, and they just call create and it goes like, oh yeah, I'm finished, I created it, but it actually exists already with a different schema, then the user's expectation might be that it's going to work with the current schema that they've provided, and it won't. It will actually fail then on further usage. But yeah, I'm not sure if that necessarily is convincing to say, well, we should be a little bit more explicit on the create. I feel to some extent it does, but yeah, it's definitely tricky.
But at that point, you can always check yourself if it exists, if so, delete it, and then recreate it. Like it's 2 lines of code instead of 1, but at least the call site is very clear as to the order of operations, and it's also clear that there's no that things can get interrupted.
Though then you're losing any data that's in there, which might be not the thing you wanted.
Well, that's assuming that you didn't know what schema it was and you just wanted to nuke it and start over. Like if all that you want to
Right.
do is just say like, I want to ensure that this
Yeah.
exists, then yeah, just call create if not exists.
Yeah, I'm not too sure
But
what
but
to do.
this like throw if exists, like I don't see a reason for that though. That's the thing.
You're saying we should always provide only create if exists semantics, basically?
Create if not exists, yeah. And if someone wants to fail if the collection exists already, like they could easily do that in their own code. Like call exists if it returns true or correct.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I think about it. I get what you guys are saying. Like I guess like I'm coming from a place where databases do provide both things. Like in Postgres or whatever, you've got create table, and that's going to throw if the thing exists, and you've got create table if not exists. So we're
Well,
kind of.
But are you saying some databases offer it or all databases offer it?
I don't think all databases offer it. Wesley would probably know better. Do you have a good picture, Wesley?
I really get nervous about adding functionality to an abstraction and trying to make it work, even if the database doesn't nominally support the feature under the covers. Like that just something sits really unwell with me regarding that.
This is what we do for a few of the connectors, like Pinecone, for example. We actually call the method that tells us whether it exists or not. If it does not, we call the method create, and if it fails with an exception that we recognize like a conflict error, we swallow this exception.
Yeah, create if not exists is the one that isn't commonly implemented everywhere, but create typically is, with throwing and everything. Yeah, although create if not exists is definitely a very common scenario, and it's I suppose it's common in two ways. One is like, they just want to initialize this on first run, and then every time that the service starts up, it just checks if the thing exists yet or not. And the other scenario is really where you're maybe storing data per tenant, and you want to create a new collection for every tenant, and you don't know if it exists yet. So on every request, you might call this to ensure that it does exist. But yeah, it is problematic as well in that, and we've actually talked about this, our implementation isn't necessarily thread safe, which is kind of problematic.
No, but Shai, you just said a few minutes ago that you expect this abstract base class to be fully thread safe, all implementations of it.
Yeah.
I swear that's in the recording.
Yeah, absolutely. What are you? Which case are you thinking about, Wesley?
I'm talking about our own implementations of create if not exists.
You mean they're not thread safe in the sense that if you call this thing at the same time, it will like
it'll
bomb?
potentially bomb, because it'll check if it. I mean, obviously we can probably make it a bit more resilient and just check.
You can just lock, right? Like for the client side implementation cases.
Yeah. Or we can.
I mean, you shouldn't do that, because presumably, if you have multiple clients running at once, they'll still conflict with each other, right? Because in your case, thread safe, like concurrency safety isn't just a single client; it's all the clients talking to the database.
Levi, you were saying that if like you instantiate two different collection instances, then of course they would not be sharing the same lock, and therefore you still have the same problem, or even two different programs.
Yeah,
two different computers.
Or a server in a farm, for instance, like.
Yeah, I mean, if we can't, that's a good point. So if we can't guarantee that create if not exists always works, and so on, then there's a problem there, I guess.
Yeah,
And does
I mean,
create verify the schema?
We don't verify the schema of an existing database ever. We can't.
So
If the only thing this does is verify
so
that the
you
collection
call you
exists.
say you want to create a new collection with the product data that you had at the top. But if somebody has already made a collection called products and it happens to be about stuff you can, I don't know, shove in your hair instead of stuff that you can buy, then I guess you can buy stuff to shove in your hair. But then you're just going to find out later when it explodes and it can't
Yeah,
match the data
that's
back up
right.
to that shape.
That's right.
Cool.
And that is something we can't. Yeah, that's something. I mean, you've got the same thing, and I think anything that you do with databases, pretty much, like this is a very standard kind of thing, and I don't think there's any solution to it. Basically, like you can't actually, like every time you create a collection, basically you don't have the capability in place to go discover the database, make sure that every column there corresponds to what you expect in every single way. That just, I mean, even if it was possible, perf-wise, it would be a problem, and so on and so forth.
Yep.
I'm not too worried about that, to be honest, because if you have multiple different clients all talking with the same database, presumably they all kind of agree on the schema anyway.
Modulo
exactly, like
versioning problems.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you could. Ideally, the way that you resolve that is to simply make a new collection, and to say this new collection is schema n+1.
Oh,
yeah, we've got our migrations. Yeah, we've got migrations stories and EF like that are supposed to help with this, but the basic problem is there exactly as you describe it. So I guess if I'm trying to resume, like to summarize what we're saying here, so client-side implementations of create if not exists are problematic, basically, and we should consider not doing them because they're not actually safe. Where they do exist on the server, we can expose them, but then does that mean we drop this from the abstraction because not all databases support them?
Well, I'm trying to think of like what happens. What would the application reasonably do if create if not exists said, yes, you created a database, have fun? Like, would it then start populating the database? Is that the expectation?
Or searching, basically using it.
Well, if it created the database, presumably the database is empty.
This is going back to the should it
there's no
return the
point to
boolean.
search it. Yeah.
But it might also have already existed, in which case you can do searches on it.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm getting at is like, are we actually talking about two different scenarios where one client is populate the database, that runs first, doesn't really have concurrency issues with anyone else, and then all the other clients are, we assume that the database is populated because, the web server's up and running now. So we're going to just assume that everything's working and we're only going to do queries, not insertions.
There's definitely a scenario where you want to create on first use, and I'm working on some memory storage stuff, which is well, one of the common scenarios here is RAG, where you have a separate application that's typically filling the database, and it's pulling data from documents, chunking them. It's kind of it's a complicated process. It's essentially an ingestion process where you chunk these documents, you run the embedding generator on each of the chunks, and you create this database and index everything. But then there's also scenarios where you are maybe building the set of documents over time across different service instances. As people are having a conversation, you might want to store memories, you might want to store the conversation history and make it searchable. You might summarize a conversation people have had, generate embedding for it, upsert that into the database as well. And in those cases, I mean, in theory, you could, of course, go and create the collection beforehand, but you would have nothing to stick in it. So I'd say a lot of people's expectation would be, I just want to create this on service startup if it didn't exist already, and then start using it, or maybe on first use. Although service startup would certainly be more efficient in that case.
Yeah, but that what you just said is another example of where throw if exists doesn't really add value. Like in the two examples that we've been discussing for the past few minutes, one of which where the database needs to be populated before any client uses it, like, well, throw if exists doesn't add value because the clients just assume the database is there. And what you just mentioned, throw if exists still doesn't add value because the clients and the populator don't care about the order of operations. It's just the populator will get around to inserting when it gets around to it.
I'm not sure I followed the last one. I mean, ultimately, with the last one, what you want is for the collection to be created on first usage.
But then who would ever want to treat the it already exists as a failure condition in that case?
Oh, right. I see what you mean. Yeah.
In everything we've been discussing, throw if exists should always be set to false. There's never a legitimate reason for it to be set to true.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. I mean, I think we can, like, ultimately though, if we do it on that route, we have to be very careful around how we document it so that people don't have this expectation that it's actually created something just now that matches the schema that I have in case the schema differs. That's the only thing that's a bit weird.
Yes,
I think.
yes.
Yeah, but I'm still.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead, you, Levi.
Well, I was going to say, like, if you don't have a helper API like this, if you tell users you have to do the existence check manually, you have to do the schema check manually, and that check has to be done within your own code, like, then that's a clear indication to the caller that they're taking on that responsibility, right? That you're not doing any type of magic under the covers, or that magic might be something other than what they expected. Like, that's the thing that gets people into trouble, right? When they expect magic A, but you do magic B instead. And in this case, there's no magic anymore. Like, the check is explicit.
So one thing I'm still not sure about is we're saying we prefer create if not exist semantics, like in general, because we don't see why somebody would want the exception. But at the same time, we're saying some of our databases don't support that thing, and it's unsafe to do on the client in a way that's safe, right? That's actually thread safe. So then, where do we end?
Does the database return a specific error saying the database is already created, or the collection's already created?
It might, and if they do, like, we could check this maybe for Thursday. If they do, then I agree. Then we can just be thread safe, right? We can just catch that exception.
But I know this also comes down to, like, if you have an abstraction that fundamentally, sorry, let me back up. If you have a world where some of your databases fundamentally only support operation A, and some of your databases fundamentally only support operation B, and operations A and B are incompatible, like, presumably having an abstract base class trying to represent both of them is not the right idea.
Welcome to database abstractions, but yeah. Adam?
Well, maybe that means you need two abstract base classes, not one. Yeah. Like, if the implementation can't fulfill what we're saying is a core feature of the abstract base class.
So a few weeks ago, I have been unifying the behavior across all of the connectors, and all of them except of Redis, we can recognize that the collection has already existed before. But in case of Redis, we get an exception with just a string. So we don't have an enum or a different exception kind that would say that it already existed. There is just a magic string that says it existed, but we don't want to rely on that.
Fair.
Like, I also would hate for the whole abstraction to now go in a less than ideal shape because we've got one wayward database there.
Very true. I think though the interesting question is, like, should we just support ensure collection exists or create collection if not exists, and maybe rely on just basically try to create, and if it fails with it already exists, then we swallow that exception and we just return, we just succeed. That would be I suppose a more thread safe solution to that implementation as well.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like if I understand Adam correctly, that's kind of what we're like. We should be doing that everywhere, and there's only Redis as the problematic one, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And Redis, you could always do a free stage if you need to with Redis, which is you query the existence. If it returns false, you create it. If that fails, you query the existence again. If that returns true, then you just say like, look, we successfully created it.
Yep.
So there are options. It involves 3 round trips instead of 1, whatever.
Yeah, that's completely fine. This is a very control plane operation kind of thing anyway. Okay.
I mean, certainly with everything I've developed so far, samples, you know, consuming a piece of code, I have always used create if not exists. I've never used create. So
Okay.
maybe that's also an indication that we can drop create and only keep, you know, create if not exists.
I think that's kind of what's being said, right? Like if everybody's okay with this, we can always, yeah.
I mean, you could add create and fail if it already exists in the future if you have a scenario for it, but from the past several minutes of discussion, it sounds like there's not really a big reason to put it in.
Right. Okay. So the only thing maybe that's remaining there is the naming of the create if not exists function, which because we said we might prefer something like ensure collection created or ensure collection exists, I think was Jeremy's favorite. Any, like a thing like this. I mean, it's not shorter, but it is less words than if exists.
Also, because you want if
that
not
sense.
exists.
Yeah, we're missing
Exactly. Oh, very good. Yeah.
That's why I made fun of it as the do nothing API.
Oh, sorry, I missed that joke.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then it is shorter.
I like ensure collection exists.
Yeah.
Ensure is a verb that I use at least with internal things of like put my fields in the state that I want them to be in. If they're already there, then leave them alone. So.
Yeah, and I do like having the word collection in this API because it distinguishes it from all the other APIs on this interface, which are key related.
Agreed.
I also like it. It's very explicit and simple at the same time.
Works for me.
Okay, then. That's awesome. So remove the create that fails and rename the if not exists to this thing here. Awesome, good progress. Good, okay. I think we've got 10 more minutes. Let's maybe go through a bit more, like I won't go into any high complexity APIs at this point, just to make sure we've gone over everything. So we've seen, we've just talked about the create collection. By the way, there's also right next to this, the collection exists. Is that good naming for something returning a bool, basically? Like just call it like this? I mean, seems reasonable.
Yeah, seems reasonable.
We are going to have ensure collection exists right next to it, and then collection exists. I'm just thinking about that kind of pair now, but it seems to make sense.
I like it.
Okay, cool. If we look at the record, like we're switching finally from control plane to actual data. So we've generally got 3 APIs for what, let's call it CRUD. We've got delete, get, and upsert. They come in pairs, single version and a batching version. Delete async, is an easy example. You give it a key, it deletes the thing, or you give it an enumerable and it deletes the whole thing. Here we've got these questions which we raised before. What happens if there's no batching API on the database? We said before, avoid concurrency here. If it's not supported, in those cases we would have a for each, and then it would be doing a lot of round trips basically back and forth, which is not very good for performance. but it is what the database supports. So, I mean, that kind of makes sense. That's my opinion anyway, as well. Like, so anything to say about the delete side of it? I think this is really pretty straightforward.
My question about filters is also going to come up here, right? Because if you have Git that takes a filter, should you also have delete that takes a filter?
Right. So except for the SQL databases, I'm not aware of any. Let's say a minority of our databases actually support filtering delete. That's right, Wesley?
Yep.
It's only the SQL databases that support this.
Yeah, this isn't a very common thing. And even for Get, it is it is not necessarily super well supported everywhere either. Get with a filter.
Okay.
These databases are typically, you know, their main search is vector search, and then, you know, any other type of search is really, you know, best effort.
Though I do think we have, like, right, Adam, we have all of our databases actually working with the filtering Get, right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, but my point is that, you know,
like ordering, right, and stuff like that.
Yeah, they don't have they don't necessarily always support all of the filter clauses that, you know, you'd expect. Ordering is varies. Some don't support ordering at all. Some support only one order option, and some support multiple, and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, that's an area where we're going to be leaky, very obviously. I do think we like, at least in my mind, the fact that some databases support less of the features shouldn't be a reason to not expose this at all. Like, it's basically, we don't guarantee that this like everything usable with this API will actually work, and that's kind of okay. By the way, I will mention that this here, the filter, that's a link expression tree. So you can use C# to express absolutely anything here. And there's a very small subset that will actually work. That's actually very important. I mean, we don't have too much time to go into this, but like EF as well, right? Like any link translator, like queryable link translator, will only work for a subset of what you can express, and that's fine. That subset also varies between implementations. So that's another source of leakiness, because one database has a more evolved, like the SQL databases can in theory support a much wider range of expressions, whereas a lot of the dedicated vector databases can really do only equality, greater than, smaller than, and logical operations. So some are very limited. And yet we still chose to go with link as the abstraction for querying, because there's no other way that would still be abstract. And I hope that makes sense to people.
Okay.
Like, at the very least, we allow, like, there's a common denominator there of simple filters that does work across almost everything. And that's valuable, basically. That's kind of like what we're bringing here.
Could you not provide a default base virtual, whatever you feel like calling it, implementation of delete of a predicate that just called get of a predicate and started passing the keys to delete?
We could. Like, it would be two calls, like one for get and then one for the batching delete. We could have a thing like that. We could also introduce it.
And then if any system ever supported delete where, then you would be able to just turn that into a delete where once they get it.
That's an interesting point.
I mean, you can certainly have opinions that you don't want to be lying, but if you're being an abstraction, and any databases or any of these data systems have the notion of delete where, then putting delete where here is the only way somebody can benefit from it. And then everybody else, you get the emulated, and hopefully then they complain to the system provider of, like, I'd really like delete where, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, but doesn't that mean that in the worst case they're potentially enumerating the whole database?
So that depends on their filter. Yeah.
I mean, I guess it's
we could always add this.
The get's based on the top, but
yeah, we could always add that in the future if requested, right?
Yeah. One of the things you could consider is on the collection, or wherever it is you want to put the concurrency opt-in or whatever, you could tell it that that certain operations it should not emulate, for example.
Yeah, like
Like-
a general do
like-
not emulate kind
Yep.
of flag.
Like, yeah, don't emulate, or a data limit kind of thing, so that the get async doesn't. Because if the top is required, the only way that it could say, well, I need to know what all the keys are, so top is int.max value.
Yeah.
Then, thing
Yeah.
to consider.
Another negative point here is that get returns the entire record, whereas all you need is the keys. And this API very explicitly doesn't allow you to project parts of the record out. You get the entire record out, and that's it. You can't just get the keys out. So the SQL implementation, of course, like a dedicated implementation, would be able to be very efficient here, but the emulated one would be bringing back a lot of data, which is actually not needed.
Fair enough. Which might be a reason to not do
And
it.
you don't think that there would be benefit from like a get keys async method that makes a filter?
Not all. Again, I'm not sure about how widely supported it is to project only the keys out. It's
Okay.
we need to look at it. I don't know that there's a lot of scenarios. In any case, these directions are super good. It's actually very interesting, and but I do think there's nothing preventing us from adding them later.
Agreed.
Which is the best kind of proposal. Yeah. Right. So currently there is this asymmetry because only get has a filtering, of course, here with this thing. In that sense, get is a bit more similar to search, which you don't see here, but this is the thing that we're gonna discuss day after tomorrow. We do have upsert, which it's good that we just managed to finish this basically this class. So yeah, don't we have two upserts? Where's the single? Why am I not seeing the single one? Yeah,
They're
it is.
both
Sorry.
there. 131,
Sorry.
132.
It's late. Sorry about that. Right. So then upsert, again, that's the thing that almost all databases support, basically. I don't think we have any cheating here or any emulation, as far as I know. So we do actually support true upsert on all databases. Yep, I don't think there's much to say about this here. Oh, we did have a lot of discussion here. The one thing that's maybe a bit too much for the 2 minutes left. So upsert does return a key here. And this is for databases that support key generation in the database. This is typically the case for SQL databases where you have stuff like identity, where you've got a sequence in the database and you want the ID back, right? Not all databases support this, unfortunately. That's another case of a thing like this. So in some basically the way we've designed it is if let's see, this thing always returns the key no matter where it was generated. If you've configured in your schema definition, if you've requested database side key generation, we haven't implemented this yet, and you leave the key blank here, then you basically get it generated in the database and you get the key in. On the other hand, if you put an actual key inside the record, then you get that key back as well. So this is always populated, basically. That's how we kind of get around the problem of some databases support it, some databases do not. I hope that all makes sense.
Does that mean you mutate T-record?
I don't think we don't have this implemented yet. Yeah, we don't have this implemented yet either, if I remember correctly, right?
And yeah, the intention wouldn't be to mutate the record now.
The reason I'm asking is if the intention is to mutate the record in V2, you'll need to take this via ref if you expect the T record might be a struct.
Right. That's a good point.
And that's also why we've been commenting in chat, like it's good to consider V2 stuff now, because it gives us an indication of whether the V1 API will suffice. And if your intent, again, is to mutate that, and your intent is to support structs, the current API service will not suffice.
That's a very good point. So EF, by the way, does mutate, and there's something a bit weird about, you upsert the record, you get back the key, but the record doesn't have the key. That's weird. Like you can't easily work with it. You now have to manually inject it yourself. It's not a super usable API, so I would ideally love to see this injected in. Have we talked about this, Wesley? I don't think so.
No, we haven't talked about it. I assumed we were on the same page, but it sounds like we're
Yeah.
not.
So you
But
believe we
also,
shouldn't be mutating?
well, I was also going to say, if you take that as a ref, it's also going to make it really annoying to call at the call sites.
So
Yeah,
you guys think we
because-
should go ahead, Andy.
If we were mutating, we wouldn't need to return the keys, right? The users could just, access the
Correct.
property.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Would we want to also force users then to make their keys writable on their records? We may need that anyway, I suppose, for well, yeah, I'm not sure.
Also, if
Yes,
you don't,
as you said, we need it because when we are getting the records, we need to instantiate them, and we need to assign the key.
You can't overload on ref, right? You can't have like two overloads, one with ref and one without.
You can for
Also-
refs. You can have
Yeah.
one with ref, one without, and you just can't overload based on ref in, out, or ref read only.
So in
But we
theory,
also
Does
we
this
normally
also-
don't overload based on that.
yeah. Does this also mean that we're potentially considering a breaking change between V1 and V2? Where the breaking change is we don't mutate the record, but V2 will?
I mean, we definitely want to avoid those. Like, we're not planning on doing a V2 that breaks. Like, we don't have plans like that right now. So it is a good idea to kind of handle this discussion for sure.
Well,
But
I mean, if you wanted to add it for V1, you have 3 weeks before you GA.
Yeah, I know. Yep. Exactly. Okay.
Are you GAing or are you previewing?
We're GAing.
This is a simple change, though, to make once we make a decision.
Okay. I mean, we're out of time, and I don't want to, go over too much. We do have another session, so let's maybe start with that next time, and Wesley, we can discuss until then maybe a little bit.
Yep. Sounds good.
This has been super valuable to me personally. I think this is great. I'm really happy, and thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up.
See you on Thursday for the continuation.
All right, and thanks people who joined on YouTube. Did have some good comments. Some of them I feel like they didn't get answered, but I felt like they did get answered, and so I didn't explicitly call them out. If that's not the case, feel free to leave any feedback on the issue, which I had a tab open somewhere. If you go to apireview.net, you'll find the issue. It's at the top. It's big and red and glowy. So click there, leave feedback, and hopefully there they've put links to where you can see stuff on the apiview.dev. And we'll be back on Thursday at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel, and look forward to seeing you then. Auf Wiedersehen.